New York City's budget for fiscal year 2027 is $127 billion, and that number is larger than the combined national budgets of Hungary, Ukraine, and Morocco. It is roughly double what the city spent just 14 years ago, and every projection from every independent watchdog says it's not enough. The city's own comptroller, Mark Levine, announced in January 2026 that New York faces a $2.2 billion shortfall in the current fiscal year and a $10.4 billion gap in the year that follows. State Comptroller Thomas DeNapoli projects those gaps grow to $13.6 billion by fiscal year 2029. The Independent Budget Office, the city's nonpartisan fiscal watchdog, estimates $8.4 billion in annual deficit by 2028. Levine called this the first time since the Great Recession that the city has faced a hole this large this late in the fiscal year. At the same time, 137,000 more people left New York for other states in a single recent 12-month period than moved in. IRS tax data shows departing residents took $10 billion in adjusted gross income out of New York in a single year. The top 1% of income earners pay 43% of all city income taxes. Each department from that group removes a disproportionate share of the revenue the city depends on to function. Manhattan's office vacancy reached 22.7% in 2024, up from 10.5% in 2019. Buildings that generated enormous property tax revenue sit partially empty, and some have lost more than 50% of their assessed value. The city collects less from them every single cycle. But the new mayor, Zoran Mandani, took office on January 1st, 2026 with a platform built around taxing corporations and high earners harder, raising rents on stabilized apartments, creating city-owned grocery stores, and making all city buses free. Businesses and institutional investors are watching closely. The Tax Foundation already ranks New York 49th out of 50 states for tax competitiveness. Florida ranks 4th. Fiscal analysts describe what New York is currently running as a doom loop. Taxes rise to close gaps, mobile taxpayers and businesses respond by leaving, the tax base narrows, the gap grows, and taxes rise again. The loop feeds itself, and the city's fiscal reserves, once a buffer against exactly this kind of spiral, are nearly exhausted. New York City has faced this pattern before. The last time it ran this sequence to its objective conclusion, the city came within days of defaulting on its bonds and could not pay its own workers. To understand what is happening now, you have to start with what happened then. The crisis that broke in October 1975 did not begin in 1975. Mayor John Lindsay built the foundation for it across 7 years in office, starting in January of 1966. Lindsay was a liberal Republican from Manhattan who campaigned on expanding the role of city government in everyday life and won by a landslide. Over his 2 terms, he grew New York City's annual budget by 125%. Free tuition at the City University of New York expanded rapidly. Public housing programs absorbed enormous capital. The city's social services workforce grew to a scale that rivaled the workforces of small national governments. And the contracts Lindsay signed with every major public employee union locked in pension structures that the city had not come closely to fully funding. Police officers, firefighters, sanitation workers, transit workers, and teachers all negotiated defined benefit pensions with generous multipliers and early retirement provisions. The city agreed to pay for these promises decades into the future without setting aside enough money in the present to cover them. When annual revenues fell short, Lindsay's administration borrowed to cover operating costs, as in to pay the recurring expenses of running city government. And that practice produced a debt load that compounded every year he remained in office. In 1971, Lindsay imposed a new personal income tax on top of existing state and federal taxes. By 1975, the combined New York City and New York State income tax burden at the top bracket reached nearly 19%. High earners and businesses began the calculus of whether New York's advantages still outweighed its costs. Many concluded they didn't. Abraham Beame succeeded Lindsay as mayor in January of 1974 and inherited a city already rolling over short-term debt just to meet obligations. Total city debt had reached $13.5 billion. Banks began refusing to underwrite the city's bonds. Interest rates on new borrowing climbed steeply. Garbage piled on streets during sanitation strikes, and murders climbed toward 2,000 per year. Heroin had taken over entire neighborhoods in the South Bronx. And as a result, landlords across the outer boroughs walked away from buildings and let them burn for insurance money, and entire blocks went dark. The human texture of New York City in those years is hard to reconstruct from the current view. The city paid its street cleaners, but then they couldn't. Trash accumulated for weeks during strikes, and police officers handed out pamphlets at airports warning tourists that New York City was the most dangerous city in America and advising them to reconsider their visit. The pamphlet was called Welcome to Fear City. The officers handing it out were off duty, acting in defiance of the mayor, but the message was real enough that the city could not credibly deny it. Entire Bronx neighborhoods lost more than half their population between 1970 and 1980. The subway system recorded more than 250 murders in a single year. Graffiti covered every surface on every train on every line. The city's property tax collection fell as landlords walked away from buildings, and abandoned housing accelerated the cycle of decline in neighborhood after neighborhood. In the fall of 1975, the banks stopped lending entirely. New York City could not roll over its short-term notes. It had no mechanism to meet payroll or pay creditors. On October 30th, 1975, the New York Daily News ran a front page that remained one of the most famous in newspaper history. Ford to City, drop dead. President Gerald Ford had gone on television the night before to announce the federal government would not bail out New York City. The city sat just days from default. New York State Governor Hugh Carey organized the rescue. The state created the Municipal Assistance Corporation, quickly named Big Mac, which refinanced the city's debt by pledging sales tax revenue as collateral. An emergency financial control board took partial control of city finances and imposed spending discipline that the mayor's office could not override. The city's unions were pressured into investing their pension funds directly in city bonds, putting members' retirement savings on the line for the city's own survival. The terms were severe. New York City cut 65,000 municipal workers. Wages froze across the board. Services contracted sharply. City University of New York charged tuition for the first time in its 129-year history. For roughly a decade afterward, fiscal discipline held, but the structural conditions that had created the crisis survived the rescue without reform. Union power over pension design, the political incentive to promise more than revenues could support, and the habit of borrowing for operating expenses rather than infrastructure investment. The city stabilized through the late 1970s and early 1980s. The mayor who took office in 1978 enforced spending restraint and managed a real estate recovery in Manhattan driven by the Wall Street boom. Tax revenues from finance poured into city coffers through most of the decade. By 1990, recession had returned and the crack cocaine epidemic had consumed entire sections of every borough. By 1993, New York recorded 1,946 murders. Large portions of every borough had become functionally hostile to normal economic activity. Businesses relocated and middle-class families left. The city's population dropped by roughly 800,000 people from 1970 to 1980 before stabilizing. Rudy Giuliani took office as mayor in January 1994 and, working with Police Commissioner Bill Bratton, introduced CompStat, the first data-driven policing system developed at scale in American history. CompStat tracked crime patterns in real time and held precinct commanders personally accountable for results in their jurisdictions. Commanders who failed to reduce crime in their precincts faced direct questioning from the police commissioner and weekly meetings that became famous for their intensity. Giuliani also appointed the broken windows theory of policing, the idea that aggressively addressing minor disorder, graffiti, turnstile jumping, public intoxication, and quality of life offenses prevents neighborhoods from escalating towards serious violent crime. Skeptics argued that the approach targeted the poor, but the crime numbers proved them wrong and Giuliani right. From 1993 to 2001, murders in New York City fell from 1,946 to 667. Total felonies fell more than 56%. Every year of the Giuliani administration produced a lower crime rate than the year before. American cities broadly saw crime declines in the 1990s, but no other city achieved a reduction of this magnitude at this speed. The drop unlocked the city's real estate market, attracted international tourism, reversed the middle-class exodus that had been running for 2 decades, and generated the tax revenue that funded city government through the 2000s. Michael Bloomberg continued fiscal discipline through 2013, managing September 11th's aftermath and the 2008 financial crisis without catastrophic structural damage, and building New York's technology sector from a standing start. Bill de Blasio took office in January 2014. From fiscal year 2012 to fiscal year 2019, his administration added 33,189 city positions, an 11% increase in the municipal workforce. He signed union contracts that front-loaded cash raises and pushed pension costs further into future budgets. Pre-K enrollment expanded to cover virtually every 4-year-old in the city. The minimum wage rose, and a growing array of programs accumulated budget commitments funded by projections of continued strong revenue. In 2020, the pandemic shut the economy down, and the city council voted to cut $1 billion from the NYPD's budget, canceling future police academy classes in a move framed as a response to the George Floyd protests. Albany's bail reform legislation, passed in 2019, had already reduced pretrial detention for a broad category of charges. Pandemic-related court closures built a massive backlog of unresolved criminal cases that prosecutors could not move through the system. Murders rose from 319 in 2019 to 488 in 2021, a 53% increase in 2 years. Felony assaults in the subway rose 53% from 2019 to 2024. Reported rapes on the subway doubled over the same period. Retail theft reached levels that forced chain stores across the city to install locking cases around basic merchandise. The NYPD's force size fell toward 29,000 officers, the lowest level since the mid-1990s, when the city was recording nearly 2,000 murders every year. And then remote work removed a second constraint at the exact same time. A hedge fund analyst who had previously required a Midtown Manhattan address to do their job could now run the same operation from Miami or Austin. A substantial share of high earners chose to do exactly that, and the IRS tracks where they took their taxable income. And their income speaks in numbers when they put it into the DollarWise budgeting app. It is the budgeting app that tens of thousands of monthly active users are using to change their financial lives. It connects automatically to your accounts and shows you exactly where your money is going. It gives the kind of insights into your spending that you don't normally see, but you absolutely need to. Take the free trial with no commitment and see why everyone is using it. Download DollarWise in the App Store of your choice or use the link below. Eric Adams took over from de Blasio in January 2022, inheriting rising crime, a depleted police force, and a transit system that had become a constant source of negative national coverage. In the spring of 2022, Texas Governor Greg Abbott began loading migrants arriving at the southern border onto buses and shipping them north to sanctuary cities, with New York City as the primary destination. Abbott framed the operation as a demonstration of what sanctuary city commitments actually cost when they are honored at scale, and New York City honored them. From fiscal year 2023 through fiscal year 2025, the city spent $8.11 billion on migrant services. Hotels converted to emergency shelters. Tent structures rose on parking lots and in parks. More than 160,000 migrants cycled through the city's shelter system at the peak of the crisis. Then, Adams declared a fiscal emergency, flew to Texas to ask Abbott to change course, but received no change in policy. The $8.11 billion those services consumed would have funded roughly 40,000 additional police officers at average salary, or 3 full years of MTA capital improvements or meaningful property tax relief across all 5 boroughs. It went into emergency shelter operations instead, adding structural pressure to a budget already strained by de Blasio-era commitments and post-pandemic revenue softness. In September 2024, federal prosecutors indicted Adams on bribery charges, alleging he accepted favors from Turkish government officials and a luxury hotel operator operator in exchange for favorable treatment from city agencies. The indictment consumed his remaining political bandwidth, accelerated the erosion of his already historic low approval ratings, and created the political environment that shaped the 2025 mayoral race. In the Democratic primary for mayor in June 2025, Zoran Mondani defeated former Governor Andrew Cuomo by 12 percentage points. Cuomo had entered as the frontrunner, backed by the city's real estate and business community and an enormous fundraising operation. He lost to a 34-year-old Queens Assembly member who had campaigned on fare-free buses, city-owned grocery stores, a rent freeze on stabilized apartments, and new taxes on corporations and high earners. Young voters turned out in record numbers. In the November general election, Mondani defeated Cuomo again, running as an independent alongside Republicans Curtis Sliwa. He became the city's youngest mayor since 1892 and its first Muslim and first Asian American mayor. He took office on January 1st, 2026. Within weeks, Mondani held a press conference framing the city's financial situation as the Adams budget crisis, a combined $12 billion shortfall across the 2 fiscal years he attributed to systematic under-budgeting by the prior administration. He proposed closing the gap through higher taxes on the wealthy and corporations. Governor Kathy Hochul declined to grant new tax authority. Budget analysts at the Citizens Budget Commission pointed out that New York's 49th place tax competitiveness ranking offered almost no room for additional rate increases before accelerating further departures. New York City's fiscal year 2027 budget of $127 billion is roughly double the $70 billion the city spent in just 2013. Over those 14 years, the city's population declined from approximately 8.34 million in 2020 to an estimated 8.26 million in 2024. Cumulative inflation over the period ran about 40%. Spending grew at more than twice the rate of prices, while the number of people receiving services fell. The budget draws from property taxes at roughly $34 billion, the largest single source, and personal income taxes at about $18 billion, business taxes at about $9 billion, sales taxes at about $8 billion, and federal and state aid at roughly $35 billion. The remaining balance comes from smaller fees and miscellaneous sources. But the structural problem is that in fiscal year 2026, expenses run $3.55 billion above operating revenues on a straight comparison. The city draws from its rainy day reserve to present a nominally but balanced budget. But without that drawdown, without a proposed 9.5% property tax hike, and without unspecified savings measures that have not yet been identified, the fiscal year 2026 operating deficit reaches $6.25 billion. The Independent Budget Office projects gaps of $6.5 billion in fiscal year 2027, $8.4 billion in 2028, and $8.2 billion in 2029. State Comptroller DiNapoli puts the fiscal year 2029 gap at $13.6 billion under a realistic, pessimistic scenario that includes a mild recession or federal aid reductions. Moody's removed New York City's fiscal outlook to negative watch in early 2026. The annual deficit, large as it is, does not represent the deepest layer of the problem. Truth in Accounting, an organization that analyzes audited financial statements from major American cities, calculates what it calls the taxpayer burden, the per-person share of all unfunded pension obligations, unfunded retiree healthcare commitments, and outstanding debt that a city owes but has not reserved money to pay. For fiscal year 2024, New York City's taxpayer burden is $61,700 per taxpayer, the highest of any major American city, with a grade of F. Chicago's taxpayer burden is $42,600 per taxpayer, also an F. Houston's taxpayer burden is $4,800. That grade is a C. And Los Angeles comes in at $1,300 with a grade also a C. Nashville, Tennessee runs a surplus. Its taxpayer burden is 0, while New York City's total unfunded obligations reach $184.6 billion. And the largest component is retiree healthcare, what accountants call OPEB or other post-employment benefits. The city has promised more than $110 billion in healthcare coverage to retired city workers and has set aside roughly $5 billion to pay for it. Less than 5 cents of every promised dollar has actual funding behind it. The remainder gets paid year to year out of the operating budget by taxpayers who had no role in creating the original obligation. The Manhattan Institute calculated New York's true pension liability using discount rates economists consider more accurate than the city's official assumptions and arrived at $142 billion. The city's official figure is $65 billion. The gap between these two numbers reflects decades of optimistic accounting that made annual budgets look more sustainable than they actually were. Since 2014, for the first time in recorded city history, New York's annual pension contributions have exceeded its capital expenditures. The city now spends more every year servicing past labor commitments than it spends building and maintaining bridges, parks, schools, and physical infrastructure. The obligations of the past consume more budget space than investment in the city's future. Chicago illustrates where this trajectory leads when it runs further. Chicago's 4 major pension systems average funding of roughly 25 cents per dollar promised. The city has reported a net operating loss in 10 of the past 12 fiscal years, despite a state law requiring a balanced budget. Illinois law allows Chicago to contribute less than the actuarially determined annual amount to its pension funds, meaning the city can declare its budget technically balanced while the pension deficit simultaneously grows larger. The combined unfunded liability across Chicago's pension funds burdens each Chicago taxpayer at $42,600. Standard & Poor's has rated Chicago's bonds at the lowest investment grade level for years. In 2025, the Illinois governor signed legislation expanding pension benefits for police and firefighter new hires, adding an estimated $11 billion in new obligations at a moment when the city was already losing population faster than almost any other major American city. Since 2000, Chicago has lost more than 250,000 black residents, most of them middle-income families seeking affordable housing and better schools outside the city. The number of black children under 17 in the city has fallen 49%. Chicago public schools enrollment today is less than half of what it was in the 1999-2000 school year. Illinois has experienced 16 consecutive years of net domestic outmigration and has lost 1.6 million residents since 2000. Residents who leave consistently cite 3 factors: high taxes, crime, and failing schools. In 2023 and 2024, Chicago recorded more than 600 homicides annually, in a city of roughly 2.7 million people. New York, with 3 times Chicago's population, recorded fewer than 400 murders each of those years. Chicago's per capita homicide rate runs dramatically higher. The city's governing response has been to expand social services spending in affected neighborhoods rather than policing, a policy that has consumed billions of dollars and produced no measured reduction in the homicide count. And Chicago needs to reduce that count and increase the count in their savings. And I hope they use Chime as their primary savings account, because they have a nation-leading high-yield savings rate. And if you use my link below or chime.com/Caleb, you will literally get $350 for free by signing up and connecting direct deposit. It's literally free money with only my link special for you, and that's below. So check it out. Don't lose free money like Chicago would. Texas added more than 267,000 non-farm jobs in the year ending June 2024. The Houston metro area gained 126,720 residents from July 2024 to July 2025, the most of any metro area in the country. 9 of the 10 fastest growing cities in America from 2020 to 2023 were in Texas. Texas runs no personal income tax and no corporate income tax, only a 0.75% franchise tax on gross receipts. The Tax Foundation ranks Texas 14th nationally in overall tax competitiveness. Houston's taxpayer burden per truth in accounting is $4,800 compared to New York City's $61,700. Nashville, Tennessee provides a third case study. When Nashville raised property taxes in 2020 to stabilize its finances, it did so as a part of a disciplined multi-year plan with specific targets, and credit rating agencies responded with a bond rating upgrade rather than a downgrade. Tennessee maintains a state budget surplus and has eliminated its investment income tax entirely. Nashville's population grew by roughly 35,000 residents in the most recent annual period, and the city's office vacancy rate sits well below the national average. The combination of fiscal discipline, population growth, and no state income tax produces a reinforcing cycle that runs in the opposite direction from the one New York City is currently experiencing. The business relocation data tells the same story across the Sunbelt. According to analysis by multiple research organizations, more than 400 corporate headquarters left California after 2018, with the majority landing in Texas or Florida. New York experienced a parallel shift. JP Morgan Chase, the largest bank in the United States and historically one of New York's defining institutions, now employs more people in Texas than in New York. Goldman Sachs expanded major offices in Dallas and Miami. Citadel, one of the most profitable hedge funds in the world, moved its headquarters from Chicago to Miami in 2022, taking with it more than $16 billion in assets under management and hundreds of employees whose income had previously flowed through the Illinois and Chicago tax systems. Citadel's founder, Ken Griffin, stated publicly that his departure from Chicago was a direct response to Illinois' fiscal dysfunction and governance failures. Jamie Dimon, JP Morgan CEO, told the Economic Club of New York in 2024 that if New York taxes the hell out of the city, JP Morgan would leave. The city's progressive leadership dismissed the statement. The Tax Foundation noted New York competitiveness ranking was already 49th. New York's proposed corporate tax rate increase from 7.25% to 11.5% would produce a combined city, state, and federal effective top tax rate of 22.5%. A comparable Texas-based business pays zero at the state level, with only a small franchise tax on gross receipts. That gap shows up in the location decisions of every CFO running a cost-benefit analysis. And then there's Florida, which offers a second major comparison. There's no state income tax, aggressive deregulation, and a quality-of-life proposition that attracts both retirees and working-age professionals produced consistent population and employment growth throughout the pandemic recovery. Florida added more than 1 million jobs in 5 post-pandemic years. From 2019 to 2024, roughly 91,000 people per year relocated from New York State to Florida. Florida's total tax burden runs at 6.49% of personal income. New York's runs at 13.56%. Miami has transformed into a genuine financial center over roughly 5 years. Citadel and dozens of other hedge funds and private equity firms now headquarter there. Miami's downtown office vacancy rate sits below 10%, less than half of Manhattan's current rate. Florida's governor has publicly invited New York businesses to relocate since the Mamdani administration's earliest weeks in office. But there is a counter-argument on Florida. You see, property insurance costs surged after hurricanes in 2022 and 2023, with some major insurers exiting the state market entirely. Housing prices in Miami, Tampa, and Orlando rose fast enough that affordability became a real constraint on continued migration. Florida's net domestic migration fell by more than 49% from 2022 to 2023 as the cost advantage over northern states eroded. Those pressures reflect a state absorbing population growth faster than its housing supply expanded. But it is a completely different problem from the fiscal mismanagement driving people out of New York. New York State spends $36,293 per K-12 student annually, the highest in the nation and 91% above the national average. New York City schools average $42,000 per student. New York has held the top position in education spending for at least half a century, and per pupil spending in inflation-adjusted terms rose 213% from 1969 to 2021. The National Assessment of Educational Progress, called the NAEP and known as the nation's report card, measures students' performance consistently across all 50 states. Among New York's fourth graders, the state ranks 32nd in reading and 46th in math. And a reminder, New York spends more per student than any other state, while scoring below the national average, which is below Kentucky and below Louisiana. Massachusetts spends $18,000 per student, less than half of New York, and it consistently ranks first or second in both reading and math on the NAEP. New Jersey spends $23,000 per student and ranks in the top 10. Academic research consistently finds no correlation between additional per pupil spending and measurable outcomes above roughly $15,000 per student when demographic factors are controlled. Researchers point to specific structural causes in New York. Union contract provisions make removing underperforming teachers nearly impossible regardless of classroom results. Compensation is built almost entirely on seniority rather than outcomes. More than 700 independent school districts across New York State each maintain their own administrative overhead. Administrative costs consume a higher share of per pupil spending than in comparable state systems. The political response to decades of underperformance has consistently been to request more state aid, which Albany has consistently provided with no structural change to how the system operates or how teachers are evaluated. The comparison between Houston and Los Angeles on homelessness produces numbers that fiscal analysts cite as the clearest single illustration of the spending versus outcomes gap between blue and red city governance. Houston reduced its homeless population by more than 50% over the past decade using a housing-first model built on federal grants and private donations. Texas state government spent approximately $806 per homeless person annually in state funding on that effort. California, on the other hand, spent $10,786 per homeless person annually in the state funding over the same period, more than 13 times as much as Texas. California's homeless population grew by 43%, while at the same time in Texas, the homeless population fell by 28% from 2012 to 2022. New York City spent approximately $81,000 per homeless person in fiscal year 2025 on street homeless services alone, roughly equal to the city's median household income. Total street homeless spending tripled from $102 million in fiscal year 2019 to approximately $368 million in fiscal year 2025. The homeless population in the city grew 26% over that same period. So, more money and more people experiencing homelessness. New York's right to shelter policy, a legal obligation requiring the city to provide shelter to any resident who requests it, produces a system that houses a higher portion of its homeless population than Los Angeles does. One could say that that is a more humane outcome in one respect than LA's sprawling unsheltered encampments, but it has not produced a reduction in the number of people entering homelessness in the first place. From 2020 to 2024, New York State lost a net 446,814 residents to other states, the largest absolute domestic outmigration of any state in the country over that period. The dominant destinations are Florida, Texas, North Carolina, New Jersey's suburbs, and Pennsylvania. IRS migration data tracks adjusted gross income shifting between states, not just population counts, and it shows that New York loses its highest earners at the fastest rate. Bank of America internal account data confirmed in 2025 that New York City ranked second among all major metro areas in net account outflow. But it's worth also noting the progressive counterargument on federal transfers. Mississippi, West Virginia, and Kentucky receive far more federal dollars per capita than New York, which functions as a consistent net contributor to the federal treasury. New York sends more federal taxes than it receives in federal spending. That structural subsidy supports a meaningful portion of fiscal stability in some low-tax states. But the counterpoint is that federal aid policy changes under administrations with different priorities, and it just changed under the current one, while New York's spending commitments are locked in until Albany votes to restructure them. New York City provides services at a scale and no complexity no other American city attempts. A subway system carrying more than 1 billion riders annually, the largest public housing authority in the country, a public hospital system that treats patients regardless of ability to pay, and more than 1 million students across 1,800 schools. These services cost more per unit in a dense, high-cost, aging urban environment than identical services cost in a newer Sunbelt city with lower labor costs and modern infrastructure. So every comparison made here isn't perfectly controlled. New York's metro GDP exceeds $2.1 trillion, larger than most national economies. The network effects concentrating finance, media, law, healthcare research, and technology in New York do not simply relocate because the tax rate changes. The city has faced fiscal collapses before and rebuilt from them. The 2025 subway crime data showed a 14.4% reduction from 2019 levels, and July 2025 recorded as the safest month in subway history on that metric. The improvement is real and came from targeted NYPD deployments funded by a $77 million additional investment in subway patrols. The question is whether the value delivered per dollar spent justifies the spending level, and on that question, the outcome data on education, homelessness, and fiscal sustainability consistently points in the same direction. 3 trajectories define New York's likely future. Under the baseline, the city avoids default because New York State will intervene before that happens, as it did in 1975. But the city continues losing middle-income residents and mobile businesses to lower-cost alternatives every year. Budget gaps of $6 to $13 billion persist annually. Pension contributions continue crowding out capital spending. Services deteriorate at the margin. Population population slowly declines. The fiscal reserves, already depleted, provide no buffer against the next recession. The city muddles through, a condition the Citizens Budget Commission describes as managed decline. Under the accelerated scenario, Mayor Mondani proposed corporate tax rate increase from 7.25% to 11.5% pushes the combined top effective rate near recorded territory. If major Wall Street institutions reduce New York City headcount by 10% in response, the immediate tax revenue loss dwarfs any short-term spending gains. The proposed office-to-residential conversion mandates face structural engineering constraints that most people discussing them don't even acknowledge. The majority of Manhattan's Class A office towers cannot convert to residential use because of floor plate dimensions and window-to-wall ratios. The conversions that do proceed remove commercial property from the tax rolls while delivering limited new housing. The vacancy rate climbs further. Property tax assessment falls further, so the gap just grows. The reform scenario requires a political alignment that does not currently exist. A genuine fiscal recovery path involves moving new public employee hires to defined contribution pension plans rather than defined benefit plans, something that requires Albany to act and that Albany's union-backed legislative majority has shown no interest in doing. It requires beginning to actually pre-fund the $110 billion in retiree healthcare promises rather than paying them year to year out of the operating budget. It requires merit-based teaching compensation, charter expansion, and governance reform that breaks the United Federation of Teachers' control over personnel decisions, allowing a school system consuming $42,000 per student to produce outcomes above 46th place in national math rankings. It requires rational property tax reform that stops subsidizing homeowners at the expense of commercial and rental properties. Each of these changes requires defeating the institutional interests that benefit from the existing system, and those interests fund the campaigns of the politicians who would have to vote to change them. Detroit's bankruptcy in 2013 marks the outer boundary of this documentary. Detroit filed for the largest municipal bankruptcy in American history at $18 to $20 billion in deficit and unfunded liabilities after its population fell from 2 million in the 1950s to under 600,000. Pensioners absorbed a 4.5% cut to their monthly plans. Retirees lost most of their healthcare benefits. The city's political leadership had assumed for decades that the auto industry's dominance was permanent, that union commitments could always be accommodated, and that the tax base would not relocate. But every assumption proved wrong. But New York is not Detroit. The economic diversification, the scale of available state support, and the genuine global network effects anchoring finance and media in New York creates a buffer that Detroit never had. So the parallel is not about the specific industry or the specific union contract or the specific political party. It is about the structural logic of spending commitments that cannot scale back combined with a revenue base that can and does move. The Sunbelt cities watching this, Nashville, Austin, Dallas, Houston, Raleigh, Jacksonville, and Charlotte, absorb each year the people, companies, capital, and ambition leaving the cities that can no longer afford themselves. Each hedge fund that moves to Miami relocates its partners' income tax payments, its employees' salaries, its restaurant spending, and its charitable giving. Each corporate headquarters that moves to Dallas takes its workers, their school enrollment, and their contribution to the local economy. Leasing agents in those cities track these moves in real time. Governors in those states publicize them. New York will remain consequential. Wall Street will not dismantle itself and rebuild in Houston. The Metropolitan Museum of Art will not move to Nashville. The network effects that built New York over a century are real and they are durable. But the margin of error is a finite resource. The pool of taxpayers willing to carry a $61,700 per person unfunded liability in exchange for 22.7% office vacancy and 46th place math scores narrows every year. Each departure concentrates the burden on those who remain, and which makes the next departure marginally more likely. The Citizens Budget Commission documented in 2025 that the lessons of 1975 about not borrowing for operations, about not allowing pension costs to compound unchecked, and about not letting spending outrun revenues for years at a stretch were applied for roughly a decade after the crisis and then abandoned as memories faded and political incentives reasserted themselves. The city made the same structural mistakes a second time, but more slowly in a political environment where the warning signs were easier to dismiss because the pressure built over years rather than months. In October 1975, the New York Daily News ran the headline that forced the city to confront its own insolvency. Today, there is no single moment. Instead, there's a spreadsheet that gets harder to balance every year, a population that gets slightly smaller, a revenue base that gets even more narrow, and a pension obligation that grows regardless of what any mayor or comptroller or governor does in response. The number that captures all of this is $61,700. That is what every New York City taxpayer currently owes for decisions made before most of them arrived. Every year, the structural imbalance goes unreformed, and that number climbs. I'll see you in the next one.